All right, I want to give you a brief little presentation here on the neuron. Before you start on your neurotransmission worksheet, I just wanted to give you a little information so maybe it's a little easier to understand. Like I said, anatomy, people, this will be a little bit of a review for you. But neurons are basically nerve cells. The ones that we're going to talk about mostly are found in the brain. Actually, over 100 billion neurons kind of always interconnected make up our brain. So first off, 3 different types of neurons that are going to be very important to us. Sensory neurons, okay? These only carry incoming information from the brain and the spinal cord. So if you pinch yourself or you burn your finger, the sensory neurons are the ones carrying that impulse, that pain impulse, to your brain to let you know that something is happening. Motor neurons, these only carrying outgoing information to the muscles and glands. So when you go to make your right hand move or throw a baseball or something like that, it's mostly motor neurons that are responsible for making that motion happen. And then the middlemen, interneurons. Interneurons are what make up the majority of the neurons in our body. These are the ones that are, the highway between the motor neurons and sensory neurons. Some are very, very long. Some are very short. All different sizes, lengths, and different characteristics about them. But the motor neurons are the ones that are connecting the sensory and motor neurons to our brain and spinal cord and muscles and everything that it takes to function our body. So, parts of a neuron. These cells here, these dendrites, are the extending branches that receive incoming information and carry it to the cell body. And the cell body, obviously, right here, this is kind of the brain of the entire neuron, and it makes the decision on whether this neuron is going to fire or an impulse or not. And then, if it does decide to fire, if it's receiving enough incoming information from these these dendrites up here, then it is going to make the decision to fire, and it's going to fire down this axon. The axon is the long extension of a neuron that carries outgoing information to the terminal fibers. And these were the messages that pass through. The messages could be passed to our brain. The messages could be passed to our muscles or our glands. It just really depends on what type of neuron you're talking about and where the neuron is at. Myelin sheath is going to be very, very big. Myelin sheath is nothing but this little layer outside the axon that basically serves as insulation. Okay, so just like electricity wire is insulated in our house to make it function very efficiently, the myelin sheath does the same thing. If you have a deterioration of the myelin sheath, then it may result in a devastating disease like multiple sclerosis. And then once the impulse is traveling down the axon, insulated by the myelin sheath, you get to the terminal branches. And the terminal branches are what's going to send outgoing information to other neurons. We used to think that all these neurons were connected. Turns out not to be the case. They are not connected. There's actually a small little gap in between every terminal branch and dendrite of a receiving neuron. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So let's kind of go over the parts just to make sure we're clear here. First, you have the dendrites. These receive messages from other cells or other neurons. Then that information comes in, and it comes into the brain of our cell, which we call the cell body. Okay, the cell body is right here. Then the cell body decides whether or not this neuron individually is going to fire. If it does fire, it sends an electrical impulse down this axon, remember once again, insulated by the myelin sheath. And this neural impulse, we call it action potential. And it actually is a small electrical signal traveling down the axon. And then when it gets to this part, these are the terminal branches. These are where it forms junctions with other cells and where it's going to send outgoing information to other neurons or possibly even a gland or muscle to communicate with it. So this has nothing to do with neurons. This is the cast of Full House. Just want to make sure you're still with me, okay? In this picture, this was before Jesse and Rebecca had those 2 twins that came along and basically ruined the entire show. This was the good old days. This is the good Full House right here. Oh, by the way, another bit of information. The 3 men, Danny Tanner, Jesse Katsopoulos, and Joey, Uncle Joey, remember? Okay, these guys are going to be reunited in a Super Bowl commercial this Sunday. That's what I hear. Word on the street. So, look out for that. Back to neurons. Okay, neurons, the speed of a neural impulse can range from 2 miles per hour to 200 miles per hour. Okay, now this is nowhere near the speed of electricity, but at the same time you can see this is very fast. Neurons do fire fast, but remember again, each neuron has its own set of individual characteristics, so no two neurons are the same. Let's go to neural communication. How does this electrical impulse happen? Let's get down to the specifics here. Well, first off, that neural impulse that I'm talking about that does travel down the axon of the neuron is known as action potential, and it is a brief electrical charge that travels down the axon. It's generated by the movement of positively charged ions in and out of the channels of an axon's membrane. Okay, so this is kind of where it gets a little difficult to understand. Okay, but basically, let's take it back to the large picture for a second, and then I'll get back to the specifics. Okay, first off, each individual neuron has its own threshold. This threshold is just the level of stimulation required to trigger a neural impulse. So some neurons are going to be, it's just like a gun, okay? A gun, some triggers are going to be hard to pull, some triggers are going to be easier to pull. I kind of made the same similarity, same connection to social psychology with people and anger, but neurons are the same way. Some have a lower threshold and they will fire more easily. Some have a higher threshold and it's going to take more for them to fire. And once again, we'll have more on that in a second. Actually right now, okay? Excitatory versus inhibitory. Excitatory neurons are neurons that are going to fire more easily because they have a lower threshold. So it takes less of kind of a push to get them to fire rather than an inhibitory neuron, which is going to have a higher threshold, and it's going to take it more to fire. So, I mean, these obviously serve very good purposes with our body. For our fight or flight response, for example, it has to be inhibitory. We don't want our fight or flight mechanism to go off all the time. You know, we see an ant on the table. We don't want to go into fight or flight and our heart get beating really fast and start sweating and our muscles tensing up. We don't want that. So the neurons that connect to our fight or flight mechanism are going to be inhibitory. We don't want them to go off fast. On the other hand, we want certain neurons and neural pathways to be excitatory. We want them to act quickly. If we see a ball traveling towards our head, we want that neural pathway to be excitatory and act quickly so we can get our hands up to block the ball before something bad happens to us. So we have both type of neurons. Every neuron is different as far as what kind of threshold it takes for it to fire, but the ones that fire easily and have a lower threshold are excitatory. The ones that are a little harder to fire and have a higher threshold are inhibitory. So when a neural communication happens, what kind of characteristics are we looking at here? Well, first off, depolarization is going to be a big thing here. This is what basically creates the electrical charge. Think of the walls of the axon like a selectively permeable wall. So that means it's kind of picky and choosy about what it lets in and what it lets out. It can keep everything out if it wants to. But with depolarization, those selectively permeable walls kind of open up and allow the positively charged ions on the outside of that cell wall to come in. And that's what creates the electrical charge. The all or none principle. A neuron can either fire or not. It does not fire a little. If it goes off, it goes off. Once again, kind of like a gun. You pull the trigger, the gun is going to go off. A gun does not go off a little bit. Okay. The direction of the impulse. An impulse can only travel one direction. The cell can only fire away from the cell body towards the terminal branches. It cannot go in the other direction. Also, there's a refractory period. After a cell fires, it will not fire again for a certain period of time. Now, that period of time is usually very short, but it has to get back into a state in which it can fire again and send that brief electrical impulse down. It cannot fire continuously. It has to have a refractory period. And then finally, when refractory period is over and the neuron is ready to fire again, we call that resting potential. It's waiting to fire. It has all of the makings of a cell that's ready to fire, overall positive outside charge, overall negative inside charge, and it's just waiting for the threshold to be reached so it can fire again. So let's move on here.